All right, so today we're diving into a world where uh, charisma and controversy, they kind of like collide.
Yeah.
And it's a question I think we've all pondered. Like, how do you tell the difference between a true visionary
Right.
and a smooth-talking con artist? That's
Mm.
exactly what we're going to be dissecting on this deep dive, Grifter or Gifted, and the story of Lance Poulsen, former CEO of National Century Financial Enterprises.
Yeah.
You might have heard about the company's pretty spectacular crash, but today we're going way beyond the headlines to uncover the man behind the billions lost.
Absolutely. And it's such a fascinating case because at first glance, NCFE seemed like a total win-win for everyone involved.
Right.
They were helping healthcare providers get like this much needed cash flow
Yeah,
and offered investors these like really potentially steady returns. But as we'll see, there was a much darker side to this story.
exactly. And we're talking some serious stakes here. I mean, the collapse of NCFE led to a staggering $2.9 billion in investor losses,
Oh.
hitting healthcare providers nationwide.
Yeah.
And to make matters even more, well, intriguing, I guess you could say, Poulsen wasn't just convicted of fraud. He was also found guilty of trying to bribe a key witness while awaiting trial.
Yeah, that attempt to obstruct justice is a crucial piece of the puzzle, and we'll definitely unpack that later. But first, let's rewind a bit.
Okay.
To understand how things went so wrong, we need to start with like NCFE's basic business model.
So from what I gathered from the court documents and all the media coverage, they were essentially buying up like unpaid medical bills.
That's the gist of it. So think about like hospitals and clinics.
Yeah.
They often have to wait months to get reimbursed by insurance companies.
Right.
So NCFE saw an opportunity here,
Mhm.
and they offered these providers, immediate cash
Right.
for those outstanding bills, of course, at a slight discount.
Okay, so that makes sense. They're helping healthcare providers like, stay afloat,
Right.
which sounds pretty noble on the surface. But where do the investors fit into all of this?
That's where the financial wizardry comes in. So NCFE took these bundles of unpaid medical bills and they transformed them into these investment products. So
Wow.
similar to mortgage-backed securities,
Oh, oh, okay.
but for healthcare debt. And they marketed these to institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, you name it, with the promise of these like reliable returns.
Because in theory, everyone assumed that those medical bills would eventually get paid.
Right.
Like healthcare is a constant need. People
Mhm.
will always get sick, and those bills will, eventually be settled.
Right.
So it sounds like a win-win for providers and the investors.
Right. Yeah, at least that's how it was presented. It all looked incredibly solid
Right.
on paper.
Yeah.
But as the SEC uncovered, the reality behind NCFE's operations was far more complex and far less ethical.
And this is where the facade starts to crumble. So the SEC discovered that NCFE wasn't just buying up, solid medical debt.
Right.
They were making massive unsecured loans to struggling healthcare providers. And get this, many of these very providers were owned by,
Poulsen himself.
wait, seriously, that's like a huge conflict of interest.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where the whole foundation of the scheme starts to, really crack.
Yeah.
Essentially, these loans to failing companies, propped up by investor money, they were practically worthless.
So the investors had no clue that their money wasn't actually backed by, like reliable assets.
Right.
Like this completely contradicts the promises NCFE made.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
It's a textbook example of deception. In fact, the SEC found that a staggering $1.2 billion was advanced to providers without NCFE ever receiving
Wow.
eligible receivables in return.
Okay, hold on a second. For those of us who aren't, financial experts,
Sure.
can you explain what eligible receivables are and why they matter so much in this case?
Yeah, so in simple terms, eligible receivables are basically like valid medical bills that NCFE should receive. In exchange for the cash they advance to these providers, it's proof that the investment was backed by something tangible.
Right.
But in this case, those receivables were missing,
Wow.
meaning billions of investor dollars were essentially just like floating in thin air.
So how long did they manage to keep this whole elaborate charade going?
You might be surprised to hear that this scheme went on for years.
Really?
But eventually, as with any, house of cards,
Yeah.
cracks began to appear. So auditors started raising red flags,
Mm-hmm.
and then a trustee bank blocked a suspicious transfer.
Oh, wow.
And that's when the dominoes started to fall.
So the whole system imploded.
Yeah.
Providers filed for bankruptcy because the cash infusions dried up.
Right.
Investors panicked as the truth became clear.
Hmm.
I mean, it sounds like a classic financial meltdown fueled by lack of transparency and, well, outright lies.
That's a pretty accurate assessment. It was a rapid loss of trust.
Yeah.
With devastating consequences. And what's particularly fascinating is how this entire situation likely resonates with so many people today.
Right.
Financial crises, fueled by deception, they aren't just things that we read about in history books.
Sadly, you're right. I mean, we've seen this pattern play out time and time again,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's with subprime mortgages
Yeah.
or the dot-com bubble.
Right.
Like the sudden loss of trust and the ripple effects, they can be felt across the board,
Mm-hmm.
impacting everyday people in really, really profound ways.
Absolutely. And yet, despite all of this turmoil, there's another layer to this story
Yeah.
that makes it even more intriguing. Even after the collapse of NCFE, Poulsen, he wasn't ready to throw in the towel. He decided to, double down, so to speak.
You're talking about the attempted bribery, right?
Precisely. So keep in mind, at this point, he's already facing serious fraud charges.
Yeah.
But while awaiting trial, he hatches this plan to bribe a key witness, a former NCFE employee named Sherry Gibson, to testify in his favor.
So we're talking about going from alleged financial fraud to straight up obstruction of justice.
Right.
I mean, this raises a question for you, dear listener. Does this seem like the act of an innocent man wrongly accused?
It's a question worth pondering.
Yeah.
Was this a desperate act by someone, caught in a web of his own making?
Right.
Or was it a cold, calculated maneuver by a manipulator who believed he could control the narrative even as the walls were closing in?
That's exactly what we'll be exploring. Next, we're going to delve into the details of this bribery attempt, looking at the court documents, the coded language they used, the secret meetings, and we'll ask you, the listener, to weigh in.
Mm-hmm.
Was this a sign of panic or a glimpse into the true nature of Lance Poulsen? Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Deep Dive as we dig deeper into this whole Lance Poulsen saga.
Yeah.
It's clear that line between visionary and con artist, it can get pretty blurry. We left off talking about Poulsen's attempt to actually bribe a key witness.
Right.
A move that, well, certainly raises some eyebrows, to say the least.
Yeah, it definitely throws his claims of innocence into question. I mean, imagine you're in his shoes,
Right.
already facing, serious fraud charges. But instead of, focusing on your defense,
Right.
you choose to engage in illegal activity.
Yeah.
I mean, that really speaks volumes about his character and motives.
And the details of this bribery attempt are pretty damning. Court documents reveal that he used an intermediary,
Right.
had secret meetings, spoken coded language, and even offered a signed blank check
Wow.
to Sherry Gibson, the former NCFE employee who could have potentially sunk his case.
It's really fascinating, the psychology behind a move like that.
Yeah.
Was this just a desperate attempt by a cornered man,
Right.
clinging to any shred of hope, or was it a cold, calculated maneuver,
Right.
by a manipulator who truly believed that he could still control the narrative even as the walls were closing in?
It's interesting because while NCFE's business model was ultimately built on deception,
Right.
it wasn't inherently flawed.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of helping these healthcare providers get faster access to cash
Yeah.
and providing investors with what seemed like a really stable return.
Yeah.
It could have been, a force for good in the healthcare system.
You're absolutely right. The potential was definitely there.
Yeah.
But somewhere along the way, ambition and greed, it seems to have taken over,
Yeah.
leading to these risky decisions and ultimately these devastating consequences.
It makes you wonder if this could have been a case of, success going to his head.
Right.
Did the pressure to maintain that rapid growth
Mm-hmm.
to keep those billions flowing?
Right.
Did that lead Poulsen to make increasingly reckless choices?
It's certainly a possibility. I mean, the allure of wealth and power, it can be really intoxicating.
Yeah.
And it's not uncommon for individuals to lose their moral compass when the stakes are so high.
This brings to mind other high-profile financial scandals that we've seen.
Right.
Where ambition kind of cross the line into recklessness
Mm.
and outright criminal behavior.
Yeah.
There's such a fine line between being a bold leader
Right.
and someone who's willing to just completely disregard the rules for personal gain.
Exactly. And in Poulsen's case, the evidence suggests a pattern of deliberate deception.
Yeah.
He wasn't simply making mistakes. He
Right.
was
Yeah.
actively concealing, this crucial information from investors,
Right.
putting their money at risk
Right.
to further his own agenda.
In that attempt to bribe Sherry Gibson,
Right.
I mean, that really seals the deal, doesn't it?
It certainly casts a long shadow over his, claims of innocence.
Yeah.
It reveals a profound fear of accountability
Right.
and a willingness to go to extreme lengths to avoid facing the consequences of his actions.
And it also shows a complete disregard for the legal system.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was already in hot water,
Right.
and yet he just digs himself a deeper hole.
He definitely I mean, he might have been able to construct a narrative of, bad business decisions or unforeseen circumstances.
Right.
But the obstruction of justice charge, that really cemented his image as a manipulative figure willing to break the law to save himself.
And ultimately, that manipulation caught up with him.
Right.
The jury found him guilty on all charges,
Wow.
both for the fraud and the obstruction of justice, resulting in a hefty 30-year prison sentence.
Wow.
So given the magnitude of his crimes,
Hmm.
do you think justice was served?
It's a question that sparks a lot of debate.
Yeah.
When I get into white collar crime.
Right.
There's often this disconnect between the scale of the harm caused
Yeah.
and the punishment that's actually meted out. I mean, think about it.
Right.
Billions of dollars lost.
Yeah.
Healthcare providers forced into bankruptcy.
Right.
Countless lives upended.
Right.
Yet the perpetrator receives, a prison sentence.
Yeah.
Is that truly commensurate with the damage that was inflicted?
That's a really good point. It raises these questions about how we as a society value financial security and the trust that underpins our economic systems.
You're right. I mean, we often focus on the financial impact,
Right.
the billions lost, the years in prison.
Right.
But behind those figures are real people.
Right.
Real families whose lives were irrevocably altered by Poulsen's actions.
Yeah.
Their stories often get lost in the headlines.
And it's a reminder that white collar crimes,
Right.
even though they don't involve like physical violence, they can be just as devastating as any other type of criminal activity.
Absolutely. In Poulsen's case, the consequences, they rippled far beyond NCFE itself.
Yeah.
Impacting not just the healthcare industry and financial markets,
Right.
but also, eroding public trust in institutions as a whole.
So as we approach the final chapter of this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
what key takeaways should our listeners be pondering? What can we learn from the cautionary tale of Lance Poulsen,
Yeah.
both individually and collectively?
One crucial takeaway is the importance of critical thinking.
Right.
Of not taking things at face value,
Right.
particularly when it comes to financial dealings.
Right.
It's easy to get swept up in a charismatic leader's promises of wealth and success. But it's essential to look beyond the surface, to ask tough questions and to demand transparency.
Yeah, it's so easy to just get caught up in a compelling narrative.
Right.
Especially when it's all wrapped up in these promises of, like financial security and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But as we've seen with Lance Poulsen and NCFE,
Right.
those promises, they can be built on a foundation of lies.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to do your due diligence,
Right.
to research,
Yeah.
to ask questions, and to trust your gut.
Yeah.
If something feels too good to be true,
Right.
it probably is.
That's a solid piece of advice for any situation, really.
Right.
Don't let charisma,
Yeah.
blind you to those potential red flags.
Absolutely. Now, circling back to Poulsen's 30-year sentence,
Yeah.
that's a significant amount of time, especially when compared to the often lighter sentences that are given to other white-collar criminals.
Which begs the question,
Yeah.
was justice truly served in this case?
Mm-hmm.
Or does this highlight a disparity in how our legal system kind of handles financial crimes versus other types of offenses?
It's a a complex issue
Right.
with no easy answers.
Yeah.
Some people argue that white collar criminals, even those who cause billions of dollars in damage,
Right.
they often receive like preferential treatment.
Right.
They point to cases where individuals who are responsible for widespread financial devastation,
Yeah.
they serve minimal time
Right.
or they avoid prison altogether.
So is Poulsen's sentence like an anomaly then?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it a sign that the tide is turning?
Right.
That there's this growing recognition of the need for greater accountability in the corporate world?
It's difficult to say for sure. But one thing is clear. There's a growing public demand
Mhm.
for fairness,
Mhm.
for a system where the consequences for wrongdoing
Right.
are proportional to the harm inflicted,
Yeah.
regardless of one's wealth or status.
This whole case really underscores the need for a broader conversation
Mm-hmm.
about corporate responsibility and ethical behavior.
Right.
What can we do as individuals, as a
Yeah.
society,
Right.
to foster a culture where integrity and accountability are valued above short-term profits?
That's a great question. And
Yeah.
it's a multifaceted challenge. It,
Mhm.
it requires a combination of stronger regulations,
Mm.
more robust enforcement,
Yeah.
and a fundamental shift in corporate culture.
Yeah.
One that prioritizes, ethical conduct and transparency.
And it's a conversation that needs to happen at all levels, in boardrooms, in government offices,
Yeah.
and even in our own homes. Like we need to be teaching our children
Right.
about the importance of doing the right thing,
Right.
even when it's difficult,
Yeah.
even when you're faced with temptation.
I completely agree. I think ethical behavior, it starts with each of us.
It is.
It's about making choices that align with our values.
Right.
Even when it's hard, even when there's pressure to compromise.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Lance Poulsen and NCFE,
Right.
I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Okay.
We've explored the red flags investors might have missed,
Right.
but what about the healthcare providers who are drawn into this web?
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
What role did they play in all of this?
Right.
Were they willing participants?
Right.
Or were they victims of circumstance? Desperate for a financial lifeline,
Right.
and blinded by the allure of quick cash.
And how do we balance, due diligence with empathy for businesses facing, challenging times?
Mm-hmm.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
But it's a question worth pondering.
Right.
And who knows, maybe this is a topic we'll revisit in a future episode of Grifter or Gifted.
Until then, keep questioning, stay curious. And remember, the pursuit of knowledge is a journey, not a destination.
Right.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.